Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Martin Kotthaus. I'm the German ambassador of the Republic of Germany to Belgium. The conference entitled Beethoven Meets Fridays for Future, a long path to climate neutrality that we are about to propose to you this evening should have taken place in the second half of 2020, during the German presidency of the Council of the European Union and a splendid exhibition in Beaux-Arts, in the beautiful Museum of Beaux-Arts. But, as have most of events of this unusual year, this conference also had to take the brunt of the coronavirus pandemic. But the subject remains high on the international agenda, as we could see once more at the Munich Security Conference last week. There, President Biden, Chancellor Merkel, President Macron, President von der Leyen, and even Secretary General Stoltenberg stressed the importance of tackling global warming and climate change. Therefore, thank you for joining us on the premises of the German diplomatic mission in Brussels, as well as all of you who are connected and are following the debate on your screens. Welcome. It is regrettable that the COVID-19 pandemic has taken such a major, or maybe even irreversible space in our lives and minds, that it dictates our everyday lives and affects our liberties. But in the end, the big subject of our times and for the decades to come is climate change, global warming, the very threat to human survival. Our own behavior regarding consumption, as well as the environmental disasters caused by the footprints of human activity, are at the origin of this looming catastrophe. We must, nevertheless, also admit that an evolution is going on, that changes are made, and that when we look, for example, back to the 60s or 50s, we can be proud of the progress made in the field of observation, awareness, and measures taken so far. Just to give you one example. If at that time half of Europe was suffocating from smog and coal plants' black smoke, we may now happily enjoy to swim in the clear waters of the Rhine and the Elbe. Change is possible. As we recall even earlier times in history, we encounter Ludwig van Beethoven, with a Belgian and a German background, whose 250th anniversary has been celebrated in 2020. He was a fervent nature lover. He had a reverential respect for trees and tenderly contemplated even rocks. What he felt as he watched leaves and birds dancing in the wind, and how he sensed the energy of the river's flow during his long walks through the forest, these emotions he transcribed into music notes, creating his sixth symphony called the Pastorale, one of the repertoire's most seizing and catching odes to nature, and one of my favorites, to be honest. This symphony gave its name to an ambitious project called the Beethoven Pastoral Project, launched in 2019 by the Beethoven House in Bonn, about the human race's relations towards environment and climate. This project brings together famous artists and artistic actions together, all of them aiming at raising environmental sensitivity in various regions of the world. In Europe, politicians are also busy dealing with ecological issues and with environmental protection solutions. Both the Green Deal and the set goal for reaching climate neutrality are very closely watched by the youth movements Fridays for Future or Youth for Climate, which revealed to be the watchmen of the planet's preservation and their own future. During the German presidency of the Council of the European Union, environmental degradation, the impact of greenhouse gas, the slow agony of biodiversity, they all have been key subjects to many a debate. And important decisions have been taken in the last half year, which now have to be implemented. We are hopefully all very much aware of the scale, of the huge scale of the human and technical challenges to the Green Deal and of climate neutrality, of the commitments to sustainability and biodiversity involved now and in the future. Nobody, no country alone can tackle these issues. No European Union alone can tackle those issues. We are all in this together. This has to be a joint effort involving all parts of society, all countries, all politics, artists, everyone. We must listen very carefully to yesterday's, today's, and tomorrow's voices. Welcome to the conference Beethoven Meets Fridays for Future. And now we will show you a short film, and afterwards I will pass over to Ms. van Nahmen. Thank you very much.
It's hard for me to understand whether the way we behave with nature changed from Beethoven time to our time. But as a human race, I can say that we've been destroying nature.
Climate change is a very hot topic.
It's on the news every day.
Yeah.
So there is awareness, but nobody is bringing about action.
And our whole systems are based on always needing more.
Somos terribles, ¿no? Somos depredadores.
Este es el momento de cambiar, es el momento de unir todas nuestras voces.
I am convinced that musicians can have a very important impact on people. They can influence people. Actually, music inspires people in so many ways. And musicians have been inspired by nature, like Beethoven, who was inspired by nature.
Beethoven is one of the great giants of music history in every sense. We know that the walks that he went on for hours and hours were the moments where he condensed his thoughts and his emotions. And the Pastoral Symphony, I think, reflects his greatest love, which is nature. The Pastoral Symphony has this unusual structure of being in 5 movements, which was very unusual in those days. 4 movements really was the symphony, and you have the opening, this gentle melody, this gorgeous melody, which is just strolling in the countryside, everything's fine. It's very interesting that Beethoven in the Pastoral Symphony, he wrote quite a lot of text describing the scenes, the scene at the stream, the storm, the birdsong. And yet at the same time, he didn't want it only just to be painting, as he said. He wanted it to be feeling, emotion. It's not just a replication of something that's beautiful. It goes inside his own soul. I do believe music has an enormous power, and I think nature has an even greater power. Projects that bring those two together are a great, great opportunity for mankind to rethink where we are and who we are. We've never been in a greater position to influence the future. And that can only happen if all of us do something, however small or however large that is. But the one option we don't have is to shut the door and to turn off the music. That's not possible.
From
from me as well, and Your Excellency, thank you very much for your introduction. My name is Alexandra von Nahmen, and I'm very happy to moderate our talk today, Beethoven meets Fridays for Future. Normally, we would have many of you sitting in the audience. Of course, that is not possible due to the coronavirus pandemic, and we here at the embassy are also practicing social distance, and at least two of us took their masks off only when the cameras went on. Three of our guests are joining us today via video conference. Joining us from Berlin is Dr. Eva Kracht, Deputy Director General for European Policy at the German Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety. Thank you for being with us. Good to see you. I'm also very happy that Florika Fink-Hooijer can join us tonight from Brussels. Welcome as Director General for Environment at the European Commission. She can tell us more about the EU's climate goals and where we stand with regards to the Green Deal. And joining us from Bonn is Malte Böcker, the director of the Beethoven House, there to talk more about the composer whose work still inspires us to cherish nature. Good to have you with us. And we are also very happy to have with us here at the embassy Adelaide, a human rights and climate activist and the co-founder of Youth for Climate in Belgium. And let's bring in now the scientist to talk more about the science of climate change and climate protection. We are very honored to have Professor Jean-Pascal van Iepersel, a top climate scientist here, who, as I'm told, talks on a regular basis with heads of government and states, and also with climate activists. And dear audience, when you have questions of your own, you are welcome to use the Slido function to pass your questions to us, and we will certainly, we will try to ask you questions here. But let's start with Beethoven, whose big love and inspiration was nature. So, Mr. Becker, a question to you. What do you think, would Beethoven today support the young activists taking to the streets to demand more climate action?
Well, that's a bit hard to say, but given his great love to nature that the ambassador alluded to, I'd say that he would be as upset as the young generation about what's happening right now. And I strongly believe that his work, whatever it might look like, but it would mirror what's happening right now. And I think artists who take their art as a kind of mirror to society, and Beethoven's work is a mirror to the time that he lived in, they cannot escape from reflecting what's happening. So, yes, very much so. I think Beethoven wouldn't be silent on these issues.
So it's interesting that you talk that his work might sound different today. Do you think that his pastoral symphony would sound different when he were to write it today, considering what is going on, fires, flooding, etc.?
Well, if it wouldn't be like this, he wouldn't be relevant today. I think Beethoven is representing somebody who wanted to push the boundaries of the artistic language of his time. And so I really cannot see that he would still compose for an orchestra. I'd rather see him like somebody who extends the boundaries of the musical language to another level, and I would rather look for people like David Bowie or other creative people who really brought music to another level in our time. So he would definitely use a different language.
And a question for Eva Kracht. The coronavirus pandemic overshadowed Beethoven's 2050th birthday celebrations, and it also forced Germany to scale back its priorities. But it seemed that climate action was still on top of the agenda. Was it actually difficult to convince the others that it has to be this way?
Well, you're totally right that Corona changed everything quite a lot for us. Was it difficult to convince others? There was this moment when we were quite advanced in our planning within the government, and the Corona pandemic really kicked in, when all the plans seemed to be at stake. The climate COP as well as the biodiversity COP and other big conferences were postponed. And there was a moment when people seemed to focus on immediate crisis, dealing with the immediate health crisis and economic crisis. But the situation turned out to be rather different from the last economic and financial crisis, because rather quickly it became clear that the different crises are interlinked and need to be tackled together. So we realized very quickly that biodiversity was actually at the center of the Corona pandemic, and that this was also a unique chance to face the Corona crisis, but also to make progress on facing the climate and the biodiversity crisis. So this, of course, happened when the multi-annual financial framework was negotiated, and climate and biodiversity spending make up an important part of that. But also you can see it on in our environmental presidency program, which was very rich. We had to adjust to changing circumstances, but it was still very rich. We can talk about the environmental dossiers later if you're interested, but climate was certainly an absolutely central part of the German presidencies, I mean, the heads of state and government spent an entire night in December negotiating the new EU climate target. Of course, they wouldn't have done that if they hadn't thought this to be a very important element, a very important decision to be taken. So we managed to agree on this new climate target, and also a council position on the European climate law, which is now being negotiated with the European Parliament under Portuguese presidency.
A short follow-up, were there any areas where you would have liked to go further, to achieve more? Anything?
Actually, it's almost a miracle, I feel, but we did achieve everything that we wanted to achieve according to our plans shortly before the presidency. And we were very happy with what was possible, even under these circumstances, with almost all physical meetings being canceled, at least at working level. And we were really impressed by the cooperation of the EU member states, and also by public support. So, I mean, you could always wish for more, but this seemed realistic if things went well, and things did go well, and I'm actually very, very happy with what we were able to achieve.
Okay, fair enough. And Ms. Charlier, you describe yourself as a human rights activist and climate activist. When did you realize that climate change is really happening, and it's important for you to jump in and get active?
Yes, at first when I started being an activist, it was thanks to the strikes that were organized here in Brussels. But at that moment, I was fighting for my future. But very quickly I realized that I'm not fighting for my future or for my generation or for the next generation. I'm really fighting for what's happening today. And I realized that when I had the chance to travel to South America by sailing boat, and I attended a summit in Brazil in the Amazon forest next to the Xingu River, where I met scientists from Brazil, but most importantly, indigenous people from north of Brazil, and they have expressed to us their stories from not only our like the other generations before us, but also what is happening today and what they're still facing today, which is not only the consequences of climate change, but also the consequences of the way we live here in Europe. So there is an impact of what we are deciding here today on the other side of the world towards the lives of others. And that's when I realized that it's not only about climate, it's not only about CO2, it's about a bigger picture about the way that we're living in general on this earth and what we decide to respect. And we have to start respecting human rights, not only in Europe, but all over the world. And this is why we fight today for things that go way beyond climate neutral goals, but also other policies in the European Union that affect countries that, for example, like in South America, but all over the world. So that's why, I consider myself also as a human rights activist.
But we just heard that Germany and other EU member states have acknowledged that the looming climate crisis is the biggest threat, and they are willing to do something about it. So everything is good? You're happy?
Yeah, that would be great. But I think Jean-Pascal Van Dieperseel will explain it better than I, that the goals that have been set on a European level are far from enough, even though they are crucial. What happens during the presidency, which means getting an agreement on the 2030 target, is crucial and was really hard to get. But that 2030 target is really far from what we should have if we do not want to drop the Paris Agreement. Today, we are letting it go. And that's why we're still fighting. The Paris Agreement was an agreement where we already made compromises. So now we cannot make compromises to reach that agreement. Today, if we do want to reach that agreement, high-income countries like ours in Belgium and like most countries in the European Union, we would have to be carbon neutral by 2030. So it's a real question how far we are. And those 20 years that we're losing now with our climate neutrality in 2050 is a real problem that will affect not only other countries all around the world today, but also our generation. That's why we're still fighting today.
Now I have a question for Ms. Fink-Hooijer. You as a representative of the European Union, when you listen to climate activists like our guests, what crosses your mind?
Well, actually, we are wholeheartedly agree, I would say, because actually we face more than just the climate crisis. We actually face a triple crisis. It's about climate change, but also biodiversity loss and pollution, and they're all intrinsically linked. So if we address only one, we will not succeed because we do face a planetary emergency. And that's why I was rather grateful to the German presidency of having paved the way, in particular, for making the architecture, the final architecture that we are needing in order to push for the policy changes that we want, the recovery, the green transition, the just transition, a regenerative agenda and a regenerative economy. For that, we need funding. And that was achieved and probably one of the biggest successes for the German presidency, because we do know science gives us right. We have perhaps even the moral high ground, but now we need to act and implement. And if you want others to come along, and especially in a crisis like Corona, which has exacerbated this feeling of, yes, there's something wrong with our crisis, with our world. Because yes, we do have a zoonotic, pandemic, but people care for their jobs. Industry needs to continue. And therefore, it is very important to have now this financial architecture, which mirrors now also the Green Deal agenda. And that will help us if there is a political will. And now we see that in the national plans coming under what is called the Next Generation EU. Why is it called Next Generation EU, the National Recovery and Resilience Plans? Because we do know that the next generation, and as it was just said, actually today's generation, we need to step up and change consumption pattern, production pattern, And let me perhaps also mention the word circular economy. That is probably one of the biggest, let's say, paradigm shift makers if we take it serious. I can say more about that, but in the interest of giving the floor to others, I just wanted to say we have a triple crisis. We need to address it holistically, and that is probably our biggest challenge.
Okay, by staying on this topic of climate goals, the European Commission, the European Union likes to present itself as a champion, leading the international fight to combat climate change. But we have the UK, for example, promising to cut greenhouse emissions by 68% by 2030. So can we do better?
I think we should not look at it as a competition. You have also China now stepping up. You have the US stepping up, which is all to be welcome, because it does not help if just in one corner of the planet people would say, I want now to become carbon neutral. Actually, we need, as I said, an all government, but also planetary approach. So I would rather welcome that. The targets that we have set for the EU are rather ambitious, I would say. As I said, we also need to take everybody along. It will require rather radical transformations with deep emission reductions. But if you look at carbon removals, that will be required also to offset emissions, not only from the technological base, but also nature base. And I come back to the triple crisis, I'm sorry to say. It's not just climate, it is also biodiversity loss and pollution. And if we only look at emission reduction and we do not look at restoring nature, it doesn't help us, because then the most important natural carbon sequestration hubs, like the marine environment ecosystem, the forest, if they got lost, it doesn't help us if we only invest in emission reduction. We need to work on all of it at the same time. And I think that is the biggest challenge. But if we join forces with others, the better, I would say.
Thank you. A quick reminder that you, our audience, are welcome to ask questions, and you can see how to do it on the screen. And let's bring the scientific expert now, Professor van Ipper-Selle. 2020 was apparently the hottest year on record in Europe. So are we on the right path, or is it too little, too late?
We'll see that kind of record, unfortunately, year after year in the coming decades. I mean, we shouldn't be surprised by that, because we are really on the trend that was projected decades ago by climate scientists working on the influence of human activities on climate. So we shouldn't be surprised. But we also know, since we understood where this warming is coming from, now it's very clear, it's coming mostly from CO2 emissions, coming mostly from the burning of fossil fuels, but also from deforestation and the burning of wood. It means that we know how to act. We need to leave fossil fuels in the ground as quickly as possible. We need to stop deforestation and indeed, as was just mentioned, encourage nature-based solutions. That means promote forestation, etc., where it makes sense from a biodiversity point of view. So we know what to do, and we need to do much more than what has been done up to now.
And as I mentioned in the beginning, you talk on a regular basis to heads of government and states. So do they get the point, or what is the main obstacle to more climate action? What would you say?
Well, yeah, it happens from time to time, but and it took me some time to understand that many of those so-called leaders are actually not leaders at all. They are followers. And who do they follow? They follow those who vote for them, in democracies at least. They follow what is said in the media, what is said by young activists. And if the opinion changes, then they are ready to take bolder action. So it's very important to broaden the understanding about the urgency of acting much more. And this is why I'm such a supporter of the Youth for Climate movement, because I think it was key in Europe, for example, to push for the change that happened in the European Union towards much more action on the climate and biodiversity fronts.
And Ms. Krach, the same question to you. There is this push for more climate action, but what is the biggest obstacle in fighting climate change from your perspective?
That's a difficult question because there are many, of course. Like Florika Fink-Hooijer just said, what has been decided, the new climate target actually means rather radical changes. Otherwise, we will miss that target. And you may be aware that right now we are still negotiating the European climate law. But the next step, which is coming very quickly, will be the implementation on the ground. Actually changing all kinds of sectoral policies in order to be able to reach that target. In June, the Commission will propose its so-called Fit for 55 program, which includes all kinds of climate-related legislative proposals. And those will be difficult negotiations. Let me just mention CO2 standards for passenger cars, which is always a very difficult one for Germany. And other pieces of legislation will be very difficult for other member states. Let me mention agriculture, where we have a lot of difficulties changing the way of agriculture towards a more climate-friendly and also more biodiversity-friendly practice. So implementation will be really difficult in very many areas. And this is also true for the budget that Florika Fink-Hooijer also mentioned. We do have rather good obligations within the budget, a climate quota, and are also beginning to establish a biodiversity quota. But this will not help if we don't actually implement this on the ground, if the member states do not actually fund projects that really bring about the changes that we need.
And Mr. Becker, maybe the key is to be more radical. How important is climate change for artists, for musicians today? What do you think?
Well, that is exactly what our pastoral project was all about, to bring musicians to the table. I think that the climate change debate has been very much dominated by science in the past, and I'd say awareness is there. I mean, all the facts are laid on the table, and as our colleague just said, you know, it's in fact quite simple to see what's the origin of all the development we are taking. It's all based on burning fossil fuels. So what's at the core of behavioral change? Is it a rational decision, or is it also an emotional decision? And I'd argue that you know, people have seen so many alarming studies, so many dystopian scenarios, and they still haven't changed their behavior radically. So what's needed is that we need to develop positive visions of how we want to live a well-lived, a well-lived, no, how is that? A good life well-lived. That's the phrase I wanted to use. And this may come through the arts. That's at least what I strongly believe. That's a role that artists, that creatives can play to give alternative views about how we want to live in the future. And there's another aspect to it. I believe that what you love, you really start to protect. And through the arts, it is language that we can express what we how we relate to nature, how we cherish nature, how we depend on nature. And having said this, I think there is a bigger role for musicians to be in this debate. There are artists from film industry, visual artists who have been much more active in the past. And we felt if we celebrate Beethoven in 2020 and celebrate someone who took so much inspiration from nature, we should now use our musicians of our time to inspire younger generations and our contemporary people to really listen to what's happening with our nature.
But talking about emotions, Ms. Fink-Hooijer, so there is this pressure on one hand to take climate action. On the other hand, there are many saying that it's too expensive, it's gonna kill jobs. So is it really true?
Well, I would say the most threatening issue is not so much that we do not know, we do know. We know exactly where are the risks. We actually now have the firepower, at least in Europe. We also have quite a good framework for a policy framework. And when I talk to industry or NGOs, or the youth, everybody asked me, we need predictability. So together with the framework, the policy framework and funding, we actually have a lot of predictability. But where I think we are needing more, the artists, the youth, those who would be multipliers, is to get that sense of urgency, because science is relatively clear, but we also know that in principle every year is counting. We are making plans for 2030 to restore biodiversity by 2030. We have now the decade of biodiversity, so we are already in this year of the decade, the first year. So we also plan for 2050 for carbon neutrality and all of this. So if you want to really have these changes taking root, you need to accelerate. And that is probably the biggest challenge we have. And I would welcome everybody who would help us expressing that sense of urgency also to political, to the political level. I think the momentum is rather good because the cornerstones are at least positive. We all know that for climate change and climate neutrality, a lot is linked to energy. And we do now have the innovation. We know that we can go into green energy sources, hydrogen power, wind, solar power. Please not so much in biomass, but we do know that we can go out of fossil fuel because we now also have the investment possibilities for member states through the Recovery and Resilience Fund. They have to take it up. Industry is ready to invest. The banks are ready to invest. Green bonds are being set up. If you look at whatever investment publication, you will see they all go for the green. Hopefully not for the greenwashing. But if all of this is there, the question is, why don't we go for it? Because it needs a bit of courage. But I would say the EU is ready to lead, and we are stepping forward with quite a ambitious, but not unrealistic policy framework. But it needs a little bit more push probably from everybody, so that people take it up. Yes.
And you just mentioned the coronavirus recovery plan. 37% of the money is set aside for climate-friendly investments. So, Ms. Shirley, do you think it's going to work?
If we're going to make it, I mean, it depends what objective we have, right? I always keep the Paris Agreement in mind because I understood this is kind of the goal. And as I was explaining earlier, we're not making it. We're 20 years late.
Once also said, when I read it right in an interview, that the Green Deal is a book cover and there is no book inside of it.
Yeah, because of course it's the beginning, right? It's a first important step that was hard to achieve. So that we of course have to give it to the EU, that it is a hard step and now we made it. So that's really good. But I think that everything has to be built. We are now really starting this Green Deal and we have to see if we are actually going to use it. As the EU is saying today, this is really the goal. The Green Deal is really at the heart of the EU today, the heart of the Commission. But at the same time, we still see inconsistencies when we see that, for example, the cap has been negotiated during the German presidency, and still today we see that it is exactly almost the same cap as the last 7 years, and it is not an agriculture that we need to do the transition, but this cap is going to stay for the next 7 years. So what is being negotiated today is what we need for this decade of biodiversity, and it's not what we are seeing in the cap. So we are still very, very worried in policies that are being decided today that are not at all aligned to the Green Deal or so also to the Paris Agreement. So for sure, there is not 100% trust yet into this Green Deal.
And Professor van Ippersele, in spite of what we have just discussed, there is still a lot of investment in fossil fuel infrastructure everywhere. How do you feel about that?
Well, even the UK, you just mentioned, they are thinking about building a new coal mine during the year when COP26 is due to take place, which is a shame and totally contradicts their ambition to be a climate leader. End of the parenthesis. But yes, there's a big contradiction between some heavy investments still happening in many parts of the world in new fossil fuel infrastructure and what's needed, and that is to cut CO2 emissions and other greenhouse gases, but CO2 is 80% of the problem, as quickly as possible. And I support what Adelaide said. I mean, to do it, we need to do it at the global level, at the latest in 2050. So if the EU, with the knowledge, with the capacity, with the funding we have access to, is not able to do it earlier than 2050, which is when the world, as the average, has to do it, then we are not doing what we really can.
And still some leaders, world leaders, seem to be sort of confused about the real nature of climate change. Just to mention one, the former US President Donald Trump. Yeah, but tell us, what was the most shocking thing that you have ever heard from climate skeptics?
I think first that a climate skeptic is not a good name, because skepticism is at the heart of the scientific activity. I mean, it's important to be a skeptic when you are a scientist. It's important not to take at face value everything. So I prefer to call them climate confusers. Mm-hmm. But maybe, you know, one of the most shocking things I heard is, you know, a few days before the Belgian delegation was leaving to go to Kyoto in '97 to negotiate the Kyoto Protocol, which was a first step after the climate convention, way before the Paris Agreement, to help climate by reducing developed countries' emissions. There was a talk given by a representative from ExxonMobil here to the whole Belgian delegation, official Belgian delegation about to leave for Kyoto. And this scientist was from ExxonMobil explaining that there were so many uncertainties about the carbon cycle, the climate physics, etc., that it was not really sure that it was a good idea to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And this kind of talks given by the climate confusers, with big help from the fossil fuel industry, with a lot of money. You know, it's almost $1 billion per year in the US, just in the US, $1 billion per year, that is given by the fossil fuel lobbies to buy Facebook pages, to fund stupid books and videos, etc., to sow doubt about the the scientific basis of the issue, and increasingly, more recently, about the validity of alternative energy and the solutions, because the more doubt there is about the validity of those solutions, the less enthusiasm there will be in the public and therefore among policymakers. So they have a very well-defined strategy to sow confusion, and this is one of the reasons why things have moved so slowly over the last decades.
And Eva Kracht, with Joe Biden now, we have an ally in the White House, a good partner to take on climate change. So how much of a game changer is this?
We are hoping this will be rather helpful to have a partner pulling in the same direction in the US, and you can already see a lot of activity within US politics and the US society, and it is certainly helpful also towards other important actors globally to have the US on board. Of course, it remains to be seen how exactly the politics will evolve in the USA, but we are certainly in a totally different situation. Maybe if I may come back to your last question just very quickly, the question of what does it take now? I talked about what politics needs to deliver. Other speakers have talked about the arts and also society, and I think this is very, very important as well. The emotional decisions we need to make, the enthusiasm and also the courage we as a society need to have, because quite frankly, I personally think that a greenhouse gas neutral world and even a world which reaches, or an EU that reaches the climate target decided for 2030 will look quite different from the world we live in today. There will be some rather radical changes. I'm absolutely convinced that we can live very well within planetary boundaries, but we need to do things differently from what we've done them for decades. And we need to shape everything in a way that leaves no one behind. And because so many changes will come about, I think this will be emotionally and also, well, it will be and socially demanding. So there is certainly a big role to play for movements like the Youth for Climate and also for artists, because artists can show us, like Beethoven did, the worth of nature and also the worth of culture, which we miss so much in this pandemic situation.
But Ms. Charlier, we saw very emotional young people taking to the streets every Friday. So that's not enough emotion?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of citizens rising and understanding and being more conscious about the situation of the world today. So it's for sure a huge change in the past 2 years, at least that I saw around me. So I think that, of course, this consciousness, we need to bring it further. And we are doing that, you know, as engaged citizens. So for sure, I see that around me. But this engagement is also present because of a worry, of a serious worry. And my worry today with what I see around me and in movements is to make sure that we are gonna, as a generation, still trust our politicians. And I want to make sure that that stays, of course, because it's very crucial to be able to live together and to live, in this society. But we need to see real engagement and strong change around us today to make sure that that happens. And so that's why citizens are getting more and more engaged. But let's not forget why they are getting engaged.
And Florika, Fink-Hooijer, a question for you. So we have, some would say, ambitious goals for the next 10 or 20 years, but maybe it would be better to set short-term goals and a certain goal for every year, for example. What do you think about that?
Well, one is not excluding the other, right? And if I may come back also to your other question, how do we get, is it a game changer now that Biden is there and that the US steps back into, Paris agreement and so on? We need to work with many partners. Actually, from my side, I reach out a lot, obviously to China, and we have to reach out also to the US. But we not only have to address them on the issue of climate change, we also have to address them on different levels like biodiversity loss, pollution. Now, let me bring in the small steps that you were talking about. We came out with a proposal last year for batteries, very radical. We also put forward a strategy on how to address chemicals and the most hazardous chemicals that we do not want to see anymore released into the environment, because everything, as I said in the beginning, is linked. Climate change is a major driver of biodiversity loss. And if we have more biodiversity loss and more pollution, we again have even less livelihoods in the future. So when we go on these, what you say, smaller steps, which are difficult choices to make, because we want the EU, especially in areas which have, the high potential on creating harm to the environment, but where also there's the highest potential to go for new approaches like circular economy approaches. If we go on these smaller steps, we need to listen, obviously, to industry, to the NGO world, to science, but also we need to encourage then the member states to take up these decisions and implement it. What we do want to make is setting standards. Now, of course, there is a risk. If we set standards, even though we are one of the biggest trading markets and the internal market is an incentive, but if we set these standards, it could be that then others would dislocate and go outside. I do not necessarily see that happening, because for very banal industry reasons, China and the US are now following completely the same approaches that we do, be it on biodiversity loss, be it on restoring lands, 30% here and there, forest strategies, deforestation, be it on batteries and chemicals, and most of all also on circular economy approaches. And why is that? Because ultimately even the own industry do recognize that our resources are not infinitive. So yes, they already now have to look like us to go away from fossil fuel. Now, I would say we do this because of conviction, because we know what's coming. But if people do it for other reasons, I don't care, as long as they go on the right approach. But this we have to nurture. We have to nurture it because we have to take everybody along, but we have to make sure that, as somebody else was saying, we go for a just transition. And that is complicated because when we say about we have to produce different and we have to consume different, of course, it scares people because they think like, oh my God, my lifestyle is being threatened. Not necessarily, because what we rather want to say is, if we don't act now, we will not have that high lifestyle anymore in the future. But if you go on products and we say we want to repair products, reuse products, recycle products, that's a different approach. It does not necessarily mean you have less good products. No, we want to have the secondary recycled material should be as of the same quality as the initial raw materials. But for today, we have a price difference. So it is still more attractive to go for let's say, virgin resources instead of the recycled resources. In order to go and change that pattern, it needs heavy investment, but also courage to go that path. But I see more and more industry following that. But as I said in the beginning, we have to also give the legislative framework the predictability that the investments they want to take is secured, but also that we all go through these standards so that it is worth investing. It is a lot of small steps to reach what we want to have by 2050 as carbon neutrality, but also by 2030 as regards halting biodiversity loss. We can't do it in one go, but we need to have an objective. We need to know where we want to end. And that I see a lot of countries around the globe now embarking on, and I find that encouraging. But it's a lot of small steps.
So short-term goals, what do you think about it? Is that the right solution?
No, I agree with what was just said. I mean, it's a combination. Both are needed and one doesn't exclude the others. Of course, it's important to have long-term goals, but long-term goals without short-term action and real concrete action starting now is useless. So it's really both which are needed.
And you've been there working on climate change for quite a while. So tell us what motivates you to keep going, even though maybe you don't see enough progress on the ground. That could be disappointing sometimes, right?
Well, you know, I love nature, so maybe I share that with Beethoven, and I really think we have a unique planet. I mean, I have a passion for astronomy as well. And the planet we are on is the only habitable planet, I mean, really habitable planet. I mean, we could dream about maybe living on Mars one day, but it will be with much more than just Mars like this. And it's a wonderful planet which is full of biodiversity, with an atmosphere that gives us the oxygen we need to live, the water we need to grow food and to have this wonderful biodiversity and nature we have. And I saw a long time ago already the beginning of that destruction from human activity. And I understood that we had the levers, we had the capacity either to continue to go in that direction or to change it and to go on a much better direction, which would allow for present and future generation and also for ecosystems to continue to live on this planet as they have for hundreds of thousands of years and millions of years already. It's possible. I mean, you know, yes, we can. If we want, we can do it. I mean, I'm a very big believer in the fact that if there is the political will, the will of citizens to do things right, we can maintain this planet habitable.
Still, we're talking here about, Michelle, your future, right? Who knows what we are going to see in the next years, more flooding, extreme weather, people migrating in their islands, fights over resources, and still you don't seem to be, you know, sort of scared about your future.
Oh, I am. And I think, I think the citizens and who are rising and who are expressing themselves are also scared because I think we were talking about emotions earlier. We really understand that it's not about nature is not something that is there that you get to decide what you do with. Nature is part of us. Nature is interlinked with humans and you can destroy it as much as you want, but by the end of the day, you're destroying yourself. So I think when you understand that and when you understand then this direct emotion to what surrounds you and being just more respectful with what is just in your surrounding, and by that I mean also beyond borders, then I think you are scared of what's happening today, and at the same time like people who are rising have the capacity to change these emotions into actions. And that's really the strength here about these people rising, is that they are able to change these emotions, and that's what is crucial today. We have to be able to, whatever we feel facing this, we have to be able to turn it into actions. We have no other choice. And I'm also 20 years old. I'm so young. There is so much that is coming. I am either gonna get depressed or I'm gonna act and try to do as much as possible, like a hummingbird. And that's when I see that there is many other hummingbirds around me. By the end of the day, we're gonna end that fire, you know, we're gonna reach it. So that's really what I believe, but there is a lot that is coming, and I am gonna use also my responsibility as a wealthy European to make sure that I am defending what is happening on other parts of the world, here in Europe, here in Brussels, where decisions are being made. And to take just one example, for example, negotiations that are happening on the Mercosur agreement is a real problem today. How can we still see such an agreement being negotiated in our institutions today when we know it's going to be part of the deforestation of the Amazon forest, that it's going to be part of then facing a real struggle of human rights for indigenous people in Brazil. So facing that agreement, I don't understand how this can be still present, and so I'm going to fight against that, and I'm making sure that we put that aside, because this is not the future, and this is not what we should have today. It was thought 20 years ago, maybe at that moment that made sense in our society and our ideals, but it does not make sense today. And we were talking about the next decade is going to be about diversity. Then we need to save first the Amazon forest, and we need to save what's already around us, because by restoring it's great, but we have to make sure we also keep what is already here today. So it's hard, but I really hope that whatever we are feeling, people get to rise up and express themselves, because also by the end of the day, citizens have more power than what we think we have.
And Florika, Fink-Hooijer, what is your response to that? How do you keep someone like, let's say, Brazilian President Bolsonaro from destroying the Amazon rainforest?
Well, I will come in a second on what we are planning on products linked to deforestation, but I would rather like to first come to what you just said about should we be scared and therefore put our head in the sand or not? And I just listened with admiration to what I heard. The World Economic Forum is coming out almost every year, I think, with a risk report. And it again said this year, the 5 biggest risks, including pandemics, are all linked to environment. Now, I have a very long past in crisis and conflict management, and I've seen that when there's crisis, it actually brings ultimately the best out of humans. And therefore, I think this is why we are rather having to fight and be encouraged now to move forward and not now become complacent, say we can't change everything. Of course we can change. We know what to change, it was said. Now, coming back to biodiversity, I'm very happy that that was mentioned. I think it is as important to save the Amazon forest as is to save and restore or keep the primary forest and that we still have the old growth forest in Europe. All are important for our ecosystems and for the biodiversity stability that we need. It's a planetary stability that we need. We plan to bring forward in the second half of this year a proposal, a regulation to set a standard indeed for not allowing products that are directly linked to deforestation to be placed on the EU market. Now, as I said earlier, the internal market is a very strong leverage for the European Union. We have to also admit that Europe consumes a lot of products that come and could be coming from, let's say, deforestation. It's not just timber, it's also soil, and a lot of other products, meat as well, especially. So we have to address it. I think we have a responsibility as a consuming European Union. Now, this is not as easy as it sounds, because what we want to put up as a global standard should obviously be lived up to also in Europe. And that's why I come and say, for me, the forest in the Amazon is as important as the primary forest that we still have in Europe. And because we have to be WTO compliant, obviously, whenever we come forward with what might be a ban for certain products, and therefore it cannot be discriminatory. But the very fact that we are working on this initiative is probably quite telling. Germany has just been, I think, debating about its smaller perhaps version of that. The UK has worked on that. France is having laws on that as well. So there are a lot of European nations who are interested in that. And we now want to also have a proposal at probably a more comprehensive proposal at European level. But it's a complex issue. It's a complex issue, but we are not scared and we should tackle it.
And Professor van Ippersel, do you agree? Is it the right way, what we just heard? Good measures, going in the right direction?
Going in the right direction, for sure, yes. I'm not a political analyst, so I'm not the best person to assess whether the set of measures highlighted are the right set or not. What I see is that as far as climate is concerned, is that the CO2 concentration is still increasing. By the way, the small dip in emissions due to the pandemics had a very negligible effect on that rise in the concentration. So the urgency is still maximal. I mean, we are seeing that increase in the concentration. You know what it does, this concentration? It needs to, maybe a short science lesson for a second, if you allow me, because I think it's important to understand what's happening. You know, that CO2 layer that we are increasing in thickness around the planet should be compared to a thermal insulation layer that we are installing around the planet. So in general, for houses and for people, when they are cold, it's good to have insulation. You put one layer, if you are cold, 2 layers, maybe 3 if it's very cold. If you put 10 layers, you suffocate. Mm-hmm. And that's what we are doing to the planet. We are adding layers after layers of thermal insulation. And if we don't stop that increase, and the only way to stop that increase is to be carbon neutral as quickly as possible, we will simply suffocate underneath. And what's happening
that is scary.
Is that concentration is still increasing. And for the last 40 years, when, you know, the first alerts, I was at the first climate conference in Geneva in 1979. It's more than 40 years ago. That's the first world conference where the alarm about climate change was officially set at the world stage, at the UN level. Since then, the concentration has increased by 30% or so, almost. We need to stop that if we don't want to suffocate under that layer of excess thermal insulation. So every measure that goes in the direction of cutting energy usage, increasing energy efficiency, remove CO2 from the energy mix, etc., is a step in the right direction. But as Adelaide said at the beginning, we are not going fast enough. And the proof of that is that the concentration is still increasing. Of course, it's not only because of EU measures. I mean, the EU's share in the world emissions is decreasing. It's between 10 and 15% now. But it's a world problem in which the European Union has a very strong voice and needs to use more of it to convince the rest of the world that it's possible to tackle it.
Germany as an EU member state, as a heavyweight in Europe, has probably also a very strong voice. So what I would be interested in, when you talk to children or students about the situation and what your government, what measures your government is introducing, How do you explain what's going on and what the German government is determined or ready to do?
I'm just wondering how to respond, because I don't think it's absolutely clear right now what the German government is determined to do. It's of course, we have a Climate Change Act, which is a big step forward, which was adopted last year, and we have a program with sectoral plans that need to fulfill our climate targets. But this entire structure is still based on the old, so to say, EU climate target, and will need adjustments. We have an election upcoming this year, and all the major parties have put climate change at the top of the agenda. So it will be interesting to see where Germany moves under the next government and in response to the new EU climate target. I think.
But do you see any adjustments that needs to be made, that you would wish they would be made?
Well, an easy one. We just had difficult negotiations on our renewable energy law. And it is pretty clear already, and our parliament actually called for more measures in this area at the time of passing the law, that we will need more renewable energy, and quicker than has been decided by now, in response to the new target. So this is a very obvious one where a lot of action will need to be done. Same on energy efficiency, on insulating houses, for example. There are really many things. Well, the areas where Germany has most problems making progress is mobility, really cars, put bluntly. Not only that, but cars and trucks, and also housing. Those areas we have many problems. And well, with the young generation, I think many are very much aware that we need to do more, and still I see it in my own children actually, that acting accordingly is not easy. Not for children either, not for adults, not for children either. So I think that actually a lot would need to be done in schools as well. When we had the climate conference in Bonn, presided over by Fiji, we had the climate negotiators attend schools and get into a dialogue with the children at school. And we were actually quite surprised in some cases how relatively little was known. So curricula are also something we need to talk about. And I think it's a good idea to have a dialogue between politicians and actors, also economic actors, I would say, and children and young people on the future that we are heading to and that we need to head to.
Yeah, I think everyone is nodding here that that's an important issue. Mr. Böcker, a question for you. What do you think about it?
Well, what I take from such a discussion is that we are talking about a deep transformation, and that it requires all creativity at all levels in society, in businesses, in politics, and therefore I'm working in the cultural field. My guess is we should judge societies also on the level that they really invest in creative industries and in culture to make it possible. I think it's more of a soft factor. You're talking about hard, measurable indicators, but I think we need the cultural side as well. And I can only repeat myself. I think more and more, as you see young people being ready now for pushing towards a better way of development, you see now many artists pushing in that direction. And we should use their support for what's happening at the United Nations, for what's happening in businesses. The people who are responsible, they should know they don't fighting their fight alone. They're huge crowds of people who really back and support them and want them to succeed. And that's, I think, where we are now. And I really hope that we don't lose this fight. When we came out with this artist declaration, one of the sentences that the artist would sign says, "We have faith that the creativity of the human spirit and enterprise, which are already delivering the solutions the world needs, can rise to new heights and bring about the transformation that will safeguard our planetary home." And when we had this phrase, there were already artists saying, well, we don't see that this is taking place. Maybe we are already too late. There was a pianist whose wife is obviously very much engaged here in this sustainable development field, and the artist said maybe it's already too late. I hope that we are still on track and still in time.
And coming once again to Beethoven, who seemed to be a very political person. Apparently, there were even friends of him who didn't want to have dinner with him because he was constantly politicizing. And he is also considered, or they called him a revolutionary. So what do you think? What would be his advice for us today?
Well, he was very blunt, very outspoken from time to time. I think the language wouldn't be just diplomatic.
Or any particular advice he would have? Fight and don't give up? Be bold, maybe?
Well, this leads to a very interesting aspect in Beethoven's work, which is about resilience. It's not so much the resilience that you have in the sustainable development debate, but he was a person who would live for music, and then he loses his ability to hear. He's growing increasingly deaf. And still, at the end of his life, he doesn't write works about despair and disillusion. He writes works about joy and of people coming together. And this has often been described as a power to resilience that he took, an energy that he took from the music. So I'm not saying, that we can solve all the problems through the arts, but it might help to come to a different kind of way of life, and don't look at a loss of possibilities if we don't consume as much as we used to do, but just see it differently and be, resilient to the challenges that are lying ahead.
A quick reminder, you can still ask questions. We already got a number of them. One is coming from Jakob von Wagner. Do you think that humanity will be able to produce enough renewable energy to satisfy the worldwide energy demand? What if that will not be possible? I guess maybe that's a question for you, right?
Of course, the answer is yes. In every two houses, the sun, that wonderful nuclear fusion reactor which works already and manages its waste 150 million kilometers from us, provides us, every two houses, the same amount of energy. Humanity uses all energy sources combined in 1 year. So we know where the future is. I mean, of course, we cannot capture all of that in overnight, but the horse to bet on is all the energy coming from the sun. Actually, fossil fuel is also coming from the sun because it's biomass transformed in coal, oil and gas over dozens of millions of years. The problem is that we are now releasing the CO2 that was captured from that stored solar energy in a century or two, when it actually took 100 million years to capture that solar energy. But capturing that solar energy directly, much more directly, without going through the fossil fuels because of the problem, the CO2 problem, etc., would allow us to have a much cleaner future. Yeah, it's possible.
Okay, so very positive answer. That's good. We have one question for Mr. Böcker. What, for example, can musicians and artists do to follow Beethoven's steps and get into action to save our planet?
Well, the discussions we're having in the music field is now very much about, how can we measure our own footprint in the music industry? How can we reduce emissions? Is the model of touring orchestras still the model of the future? How do we reach audiences through our music? And everybody can imagine that the pandemic was quite a catalysator for developments into new ways of performing music. So that's what I think that are the tasks we have to fulfill ourselves. And what they can do is, as Beethoven, believe into or adhere to the Age of Enlightenment, fight climate denialism, and present a brighter future of a planet that serves all the people and future generations. I think that's the role we have to play.
There is one more question going in this direction also. Someone asking, how can a musician best contribute to achieving climate neutrality? I guess that's what you just talked about. Maybe you would like to add anything?
Well, one more thought. Music is a very immaterial form of art and expression. And it's in its essence, it's anti-consumerism. And the lifestyle that musicians have is about sharing and be together with people and be creative and not to consume. So in a way, this is an answer to the question.
Sure. Maybe I can add to this. If there are artists that, in the past 2 years, I've seen more and more artists come in to help out in our movement. And I mean, there is already many examples like we have talked about already earlier, but of artists coming out or musicians and playing to drive the attention also on these thematics. A big, amazing ideal would see a whole orchestra in front of a European Parliament to put pressure instead of a strike, especially during a pandemic, seeing musicians rising around the world to stand for this, and they play their music, but to stand for such a message. So artists, we clearly need them also in this fight to also put a certain pressure.
And I would like to put this question also to Eva Kracht. Maybe we also should talk about politicians, right? What should they do? Leading, with their example, maybe we should see more politicians talking about what they personally do on the topic.
Yeah, that that could be an interesting element, I think. As a group, as a government, we are also actually trying to lead by example. The German government has decided to become climate neutral and is now working on implementing that, which involves a number of measures. But there always, in Germany, we have journalists investigating how many times politicians use government airplanes, those small airplanes that fly only for a few people. And also there are regularly lists of the official cars politicians use. And I think those are actually good questions of journalists being asked to politicians, because I agree that it's important to not only design the politics in the right way, but to also lead by example.
That's
Actually,
interesting.
can I
sure.
add one thought on the question of music? You asked very early on in today's discussion, what would Beethoven sound like today? And what came to my mind is this edition of the Four Seasons by Antonio Vivaldi, Climate Change Adjusted. It sounds rather wrong. You may know it. If you don't, it's worth listening to.
Thank you for that. And Ms. Chalice, a question for you, I guess. What are the next projects for Youth for Climate? Despite the pandemic, do you plan to have something similar like Fridays for Futures, maybe with Beethoven's music? That would be cool, right?
That would be really nice. I think if there is an orchestra that would be willing to come, or any musician to help us out with that, we would be delighted. But we are still very active even during this pandemic. It is, of course, really hard because our best way of action was being in the streets, and now this is a bit taken away from us, but we are still there, still putting pressure. We have, for example, I have myself with other activists written an open letter to our world leaders and to demand to continue this pressure, and there are concrete demands. The first one is, of course, stop all investments in fossil fuel starting today. And thanks to that open letter, we have also received several meetings with world leaders like Angela Merkel, Ursula von der Leyen and others to be able to communicate to them the message that we usually communicate in the streets, but that we are not able to do so today. So it's still happening. We are having these really important meetings to keep putting the pressure. And we are also having actions which are very symbolic, and we are actually using more and more art and culture, especially today where it's actually missing for everyone. So, for example, our next action is on the 19th of March. It's going to be globally everywhere in the world, and a big one also in Berlin. And we will be in a street decorating the street by imagining what we want the future to be and to look like, and the present already that we're building today to look like. So we are actually asking artists to come and join us and help us imagine that world, to be very creative and to be also very positive on what we need, because clearly we need a positive vibe in our atmosphere today. But it's also a way for us to show that we are still here, that citizens are still scared, and that even if we are facing this corona crisis, sadly, that doesn't put away other crises and other thematics that need to be put forward also today. So we have to make sure to start, looking at different thematics, also in media, but also in our politics, and also in the policies that are going to be taken to face corona in the next days, in the next weeks, next months. And again, if there are artists that want to come help, we are all for it.
And Professor van Ipperzelle, I have, I think, one question that you could maybe answer, talking about positive stuff. What is the positive vision behind climate neutrality? How will we be living in 2050? If everything goes right?
Yeah. Well, the good thing, one good thing about moving towards a climate neutral society, and a society where much less fossil fuel is used than today, is that at the same time we will reduce air pollution and a lot of water pollution and soil pollution as well at the same time. So we can protect climate by going for climate neutrality and stopping using fossil fuel as quickly as possible. But we will also benefit enormously by cutting the air pollution, which is killing between 7 and 8 million people every year on this planet, just because people breathe in those small particles, etc., which give them lung cancer and plenty of other diseases. So there are multiple benefits from fighting for a better climate and fighting for climate neutrality. There are benefits in many areas. The just transition was mentioned earlier, a very clear example. A lot of the action that is needed in Europe, and it was mentioned earlier, is in improving the insulation, not the thermal insulation of the planet, there is too much of that, but the insulation of buildings, so that they use much less energy. To do that, to transform the existing building stock into much more efficient building using much less energy will require jobs, and will require a lot of contributions from people to do that. So we can have meaningful economic activity to renovate and improve the insulation of the building stock in the EU, for example, and at the same time fight climate change and improve air quality and protect biodiversity. It is possible. It's very important actually to integrate the fight against climate change with other goals. And a good framework actually to do that is the 17 Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the UN, and it's not totally a coincidence, the same year as the Paris Agreement in 2015. Goal number 13 in that collection is protect climate, is climate action. There are other goals to protect biodiversity, to give access to energy to everyone, education to everyone, to fight poverty. And if we look at climate change in a more holistic way, we can actually have plenty of benefits in other sectors as well. And then we would go towards a much better world, actually, if we want.
So Florika, Fink-Hooijer, how are we going to convince those EU members that still rely on coal, for example, that we are heading into a much better, brighter future if we reach our goals?
Well, I think by disincentivizing and by setting positive incentives for using renewable energy. And that's exactly what is done with, as I said in the beginning, with the financial architecture now under the MFF. You have different incentives to invest rather in green energy, in green buildings, as it was just said, in biodiversity and all of this, because there's a lot of financial firepower available in order to move away. Now, one has to be very honest. When we look at the recovery and resilience plans that are now put forward, still a number of member states will go from fossil fuels, which is, let's say, or from coal to gas, still fossil fuel. And we are looking at that critically. We do recognize that for some it is a transition, provided it is a transition and not locking in a new form of fossil fuel use. So I think that you can incentivize, that's possible. I'm not sure whether I'm able to also come back to some of these things that were said before on artists or on the use, but
if you want to. Would you like to comment on what artists should do to
Yes, because I wanted to comment because I think I just heard the word, we want to create the future we want. And I think this is something which was resonating because we had a project now just launched by President von der Leyen, which was the European Bauhaus. Now, when you talk about artists, we today speak a lot here today in this event about composers and musicians, but you also have architects, you have, painters, you have singers, you have all kinds of artists, right? And they all can contribute to a movement for change. And when President von der Leyen launched this idea of the European Bauhaus, that was not so much to, it is basically an idea of an incubator for a new form of living, which is not just about houses. It can also be about different ways of consumption, different way of using soil, using the way where you put your house or how you want to work and live as a society. So it's much more than just about Bauhaus in the traditional sense, but it's an initiative that probably combines and should combine ideas on of course, what is environmental, sound or green living, but also what is an economic and cultural green living. It is really combining all different ideas from design to sustainability, but also, as was just said, affordability. How can we afford in the future to live? What is accessible as well? It's not just about what type of houses would make a living more accessible for different people. So I just wanted to mention it because we hope that it would inspire a lot of artists in the broadest sense, but also young people to come forward with ideas. And I just wanted to mention that.
And of course, we could talk for hours, at least I could, but that's apparently all time we have for. So thank you very much for being here with us tonight. Really great discussion. Thank you for that. And many thanks, of course, to our guest to the German Embassy for hosting this event. And over to you, Mr. Ambassador.
Well, dear panel, dear Ms. van Nahmen, ladies and gentlemen, we covered a lot of ground today. Truthfully, a lot. We went all the way to the solar system and into the sun. So thank you for that, Mr. van Ippersele. And I think we all learned today that we have only one planet to take care of. We only have one planet we can live on, where we have a future. But at the same time, I come out of this discussion in a rather optimistic mode. Yes, we heard a lot about the need for change. And we heard a lot about the need for urgent change and radical change. And there's no doubt to that. That is needed, and we all know how difficult change by itself is, and a radical, urgent change is even more difficult. But we also heard a lot about proposals. What is happening? What has been happening? And yes, it took a lot of time. The first conference where the professor went to was in 1974. A lot of time has passed by. But I have to congratulate in particular also Annelie Charlier and her movement, Youth for Climate and Fridays for Future. They changed the discussion a lot, at least here in Belgium and in Europe and elsewhere as well. So we have now seen change. We have now also seen more changes in Europe happening over the last half year and for the future to come. Europe is a tricky consensus and compromise machinery. And sometimes you have one agreement which then has to be followed up by something else. And yes, we all know that the change is needed and the change has to be urgent, and perhaps we have to discuss further changes more, but they will come anyway. So for this evening, I really have to congratulate everybody to really making very interesting points, mixing music, artists, and planetary changes and climate questions. And I think making it clear, it depends upon us all to really make what is necessary and what is important. Germany has been is part of a trio presidency, combining Germany, Portugal, and Slovenia. Our presidency is over, but our Portuguese presidency is now happening. And so I would now ask my dear colleague, Ms. Thelma Branco, from the Portuguese Permanent Representation. So what is now on your agenda for the next months to come in order to bring forward the things we have been discussing this evening?
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you for the invitation to the Portuguese Permanent Representation to be here today as well. It was indeed an interesting debate and plenty of interesting ideas, and I think that Portugal will have the presidency in a key moment where an extra piece of the puzzle will come in. And I would allow myself to add also the third element. As the ambassador has just mentioned, this idea of the urgency of action and the need to have a vision, but also concrete actions right now. And this, I think, that fits in very well with the message that we heard of the importance of hearing the message from Beethoven's work, the message from the Fridays for the Future movement, and I would add also the main motto of the Portuguese presidency, which is a time to deliver for a fair, green and digital transition. And as I mentioned, Portugal will have the presidency in a moment where we're starting to discuss the real implication, the real implementation of the European Green Deal. And I think that we'll have, as Germany already had, the beginning of some legislative proposals and the implementation of some policy that will make it concrete and real for European citizens what are we talking about when we mean the European Green Deal and this need for action and the transition for a green society. And I would highlight three areas, three files in which we will be working on. The climate law, which was quite mentioned today, and follow up the work done by the German presidency. Portugal will aim to conclude this negotiation with the European Parliament to advance as much as possible towards this conclusion. And we all know that the climate law, it is the cornerstone for the European policy making and in terms of climate, with implications far beyond climate and environment, and in view of this goal that we have to be climate neutral. But also I think that several speakers tonight mentioned also this idea of an holistic approach and interlinkages beyond climate and biodiversity, we heard, and pollution and circular economy. And I would also highlight the second file that I think brings this action in a very concrete way, which is the 8th Environmental Action Programme. Mm-hmm. For several decades, the environmental action programs have provided a policy framework for a coordinated action and defined priority objectives with a medium and long-term vision, which is something that we also addressed tonight. And it's true that the 8th EAP comes in a time, in a context clearly marked by the European Green Deal, but it is also the opportunity to put into reality this European Green Deal in terms of concrete objectives and being very much in line with the objectives of the Green Deal, and also helping to mobilize the different stakeholders, something that we also heard today. So bringing in the national administrations, local administrations, citizens, civil society, having into attention to environmental education, and then bringing in musicians or future musicians as well. So I would also highlight this file that under the Environmental Council we will work towards advancing as much as possible and having a position from the Council so that we can then conclude negotiations with the Parliament as soon as possible. And the final file that I would highlight, which was something that's also mentioned tonight, is the proposal for a regulation on batteries and waste batteries, which some have called on its own a European Green Deal on its own due to the broad scope and ambitious objectives of this proposal. This is a proposal which will be key for us to put into place our climate neutrality goals, our sustainable mobility goals, but also having in mind this idea of a circular economy and the need to introduce sustainability all across the batteries value chain, which will be key for this transition. And we are now in the early stage of negotiation. This, as I said, is quite an ambitious proposal, but I would highlight it because I think in itself reflects the objectives of the Green Deal in terms of a fair and sustainable transition. We will be working also on other files, of course, still on climate change, the other component other than mitigation, so adaptation, a theme very dear to Portugal. So we will be working on the follow-up, the strategy that we are waiting for this week to be presented by the European Commission, the strategy on adaptation to climate change. We will also be working on follow-up to the chemical strategy also mentioned here today. We will have other files such as the regulation on ORUS, so on the access to justice on environmental matters, so something also quite important for the civil society and the movements that we are that we have here today with us. So I would highlight, like I said, that Portugal will have the presidency in a key moment for the implementation of the Green Deal. Something that, as we mentioned today, this is when the implementation is the part where things become concrete but also difficult. And we will do our best to advance as much as possible in these files so that the European Union can be ready to implement the goals behind the European Green Deal and towards a climate neutrality.
Ms. Branco, I think we all cross our fingers here for the Portuguese presidency and your success. Ladies and gentlemen, dear members of the panel, all left for me now is to say thank you. I leave this evening with a rather positive view of the carbon neutral society in 2050 or perhaps earlier, which Professor van Ippersele showed us and demonstrated to us. What is now left over, we all have to work together on achieving that goal, and perhaps by sometimes whistling the Pastorale. Thank you very much. Have a lovely evening and hope to see you soon at the next sustainability talks from the German Embassy. Have a good evening.